I came here to help prepare two old pieces of electronic music for performance in Tsonami. Music for Solo Performer from 1965 and Bird and Person Dining from 1975. Both are by Alvin Lucier, who is still alive. He's 80, but he was one of the pioneers in that time period of these pieces that really changed what we call the fundamental character of music. Music after Cage, yes, but also music after these composers of Lucier's generation. And these pieces were made with very crude technology. Amplifiers, speakers, feedback. The most sophisticated thing in the whole concert was this amplifier to amplify the brainwaves, which is a piece of medical equipment that's existed a lot longer than live electronic music. So these composers were known as composer performers because in those years, orchestras, chamber music groups didn't want to play this music. They thought it was crazy. They thought it was stupid. They thought it wasn't music. So composers like Lucier and Steve Reich and Phil Glass and Lamont Young and Pauline Oliveros, they had their own groups that would perform their own music. And because of that, a lot of the music is in the oral tradition, like folk music. You know, you don't write down folk music, you sing it to someone and they learn it from you. It's a very beautiful, very timeless idea, electronic folk music. But there's a danger that if nobody hears the song, it will be lost, because there were no scores you could really follow for a lot of this music. So there's a transmission of culture. I was a student of Lucier's when I was in university. It was a wonderful period in the 70s. And he used his students as cheerful slave labor. You know, we'd love to do concerts. He'd say, come and do a concert with me, help me carry all the equipment, and I'll buy you dinner. And we would think this was the greatest thing on earth, you know? And we'd visit and we'd meet all these great people. So I know these pieces from years ago. And I think that my work here was really very simple. It was just carrying that information down and telling the people working for Tsonami. And they could have done it without me. I mean, it's just gives you a little reassurance, like someone holding the back of the bicycle when you first learn to bicycle. I also feel as though I've just infected Chile with a virus. I was very lucky. When I went to university, I was very unsure what I wanted to do. I was very interested in music, but the reason I chose this university, Wesleyan University, was actually because I had a very strong program in Indian music, and I knew I wanted to study Indian music, which I did very intensively. But I met Lucier the first day I was there. I had a very, very smart advisor on the faculty who heard me talking about what I was interested in and said, you should meet this guy, Lucier. He makes music with bats. And I thought, wow, that's hip. You know, I was from New York. I was a smartass, and I thought I knew everything. But I actually didn't know of Lucier's music in 1972. And when my advisor said, this man makes music with bats, I said, I'll take his course. So it started a very close relationship because both my parents are architectural historians, and I spent a childhood being dragged through buildings the way some children are taken to ball games. And Lucier at that time was doing a lot of music based on architectural acoustics and acoustical phenomena. So this was a real point of connection for me. What was very liberating about the music of this epoch was that before these composers, if you wanted to make music seriously, anything but pop music, your reference point was the history of Western art music. That was what you connected to. That was just a given, an assumption. And maybe you like rock and roll, but you have to love Bach. Maybe you like the Art Ensemble of Chicago, but you have to love Beethoven. And I didn't know if I really loved them. I liked them, but I didn't know if I really loved them. And these composers like Lucier and Robert Ashley and that whole generation, they said, no, you know, you can make music that comes not out of that European tradition, but out of the music of another culture, or out of a scientific discovery, or out of a literary work, or out of a painting. I mean, they just sort of blew open the idea of what music was about. And when I realized music could be about anything that mattered to me, then I realized I could be a composer too. Now, whether I've been a good composer or not is still open to question. And the longer I live, the more I realize that of that generation of avant-garde composers, the ones whose work have survived the best, the ones whose work we still look at and say, wow, what a great piece of music, are usually the ones who have a very strong traditional sense of music, a very strong understanding of musical functions, which you get from studying all that old music. So the way my music evolved was I was very much influenced by Lussier when I was a student, and my early work in particular all has to do with acoustics one way or the other. And it became more and more minimal towards the middle of the 70s and end of the 70s. And then a few things happened. First of all, I started working with microcomputers at the end of the 70s, very early, before the Apple, and got very interested in using computers to structure music. I've always been fascinated by the music of Christian Wolff, and I always felt that those coordination scores of Christian Wolff from the early 60s predicted computer music because of the way they organized time and material. And then I moved back to New York, where I'm from, in 1980, and I got very involved in the downtown improvised music scene, and started working much more with players, improvisers mostly, in conjunction with electronics and computers. And I also was very close to a lot of the noise bands and rock bands in downtown New York. I produced records for many years, and actually started a record label. So I think that what happened in the second phase of my life was I lost my purity. I was no longer as focused. I mean, you look at Lamont Young at one extreme, and you look at Nick Collins somewhere in the middle, and you notice that Nick Collins is much more confused than Lamont Young. But I like that. I like setting up situations in which responsibility is shared by the people who participate in the music. If it's a solo piece, I don't mind being a totalitarian bastard and doing exactly one thing. But if I'm working with 5 people, I don't want to be an asshole. I want to incorporate their intelligence, their decision, their sense of aesthetic. I don't feel I can guess better than they can in many situations. So I was very happy to discover improvised music and be able to make a connection to that world. And I think what happened in the long form of my music is that in the last 5 or 10 years, since I started teaching, I've re-immersed myself in very sort of fundamental electronic music, and I'm doing pieces now with computers, but I'm also doing pieces that work with very low-level electronics. And this is clearly an inspiration for my students who wanted me to develop a course in hacking and bending. It's funny about the future. Sometimes it looks a lot like the past. I have a friend, he's one of the great rock guitarists of all time, Robert Poss from Band of Susans. And he once told me history is like a record. He says it's not like a circle. It's like a spiral groove in a record. And you always come back to sort of the same place, but it's always displaced by a little bit. And he was a history major in university, so I trusted him. And I later discovered there's a rather well-known Swiss philosopher named Jakob Burckhardt who basically said the same thing, but I don't think he compared it to a vinyl record. The Swiss, except for Christian Marclay, don't do that very much. I see cycles, and I see it in many music communities. Obviously, the pop world, you're constantly digesting yourself and spitting yourself back out again. I mean, Retromania is this wonderful book by Simon Reynolds that talks about this. And in my strange world of this sort of experimental modern music, I see it happening. I see these cycles. And what I've seen in the last 10 years is I've seen the computer become the dominant instrument in almost all forms of music. And it's obviously incredibly powerful, and I use it all the time. But it lacks a certain physicality. It's a difficult instrument to play compared to like a drum or a guitar. And that limits your ability to create certain types of music with it. And I think that circuit bending grew up as a reaction to the non-physical nature of computers and software. And the subsequent interest in things like the Arduino as an interface between the real world and a computer, this small Arduino circuit, and the kind of hardware hacking projects that I've been involved in are a response to the non-physicality of the computer. So that conflict between the power of the computer and its somewhat, we might say, its thwarted expressiveness is an area where I'm looking very carefully these days everywhere to see how people are solving that. And what I've found is some very interesting scenes which really are, in one sense, very historical, which is that they're going back to working with very basic electronics. They're not using computers, they're not using effect pedals. They're using things like contact mics and coils and electric motors and broken hard drives and turntables without records on them. And they're basically getting down at the very ground level of electronics. And I wouldn't be surprised if soon we see artists making their own semiconductors. I've seen some websites that give you instructions on how to make your own transistor in your kitchen. And I somehow think that we might be looking at that coming down the line, which is a sort of an exploration of almost the basic physics of new music. And I've seen signs of this in the most unusual places. I mean, I definitely saw it in the festival last year here, and to some degree this year, but last year it was really shocking. A whole night of music like this, the first night I arrived. And I saw a wonderful festival in Geneva that gathered together a number of artists from across Europe who work at this level. Italy, France, Switzerland. I've seen a number of people. And then I was just in Seoul in South Korea, where there's a terrific, quite small scene organized around some organizations and spaces that go by the name of Dotolim and Balloon and Needle. And they're also doing rather beautiful work on this level. And I think one of the nicest things about these new scenes is that they've embraced improvisation very fully. There's a tremendous amount of improvisation that takes place, but it doesn't really sound like any improvisation you've heard before because the instruments are so different to play.